We all have them. We just never see them. And it usually takes somebody being really close to us to spot them. And no, I'm not talking about your pimples. And early on in our marriage, both Stephanie and I, we discovered that we had them. We were in school full-time and working part-time. And so we really were gone all day, and we didn't really get to relax until about 10, 11 o'clock at night. And by that time, we were exhausted and we were hungry. And so we would scarf some food down, we would talk a little bit, and then we would head for bed. And when our heads hit the pillow, our brains functioned completely different. I mean, we were on two different pages. My brain shut down to prepare for sleep, and Stephanie's brain lit up to process her day. And I can't tell you when this began to happen, and for your knowledge, I ran this story by Stephanie to make sure it was okay that I shared this with you, and she laughed, and she said it was okay, and we laugh about this story now. But in the back of my mind, as Stephanie is just unpacking her day, the thought that went through my head is, why is she still talking? I mean, it was a complete mystery to me. And I didn't understand that our brains functioned differently. And at some point, I began to develop this habit of cutting Stephanie off in the middle of her stories by saying, honey, I love you. And then I'd roll over and go to sleep. And I didn't realize I was doing this. I was completely clueless that this was going on. And it was really a total man moment at its finest. And then one morning, Stephanie pointed it out. And she said, Skyler, do you realize that when I'm telling you something when we're laying in bed, that you cut me off when you say, honey, I love you? It's like you're saying, okay, stop talking now. And being the humble, self-aware man that I am, I denied it, and I assured her that she just misunderstood my intentions. And then it happened that night. I mean, it was like clockwork. Stephanie was telling me about her day, and I kid you not, I cut her off mid-sentence, and I said, honey, I love you. And then I rolled over. I mean, it was one of those moments where you just put the palm to your forehead, and you go, that just happened, you know? And we all have them. We all have them. You know what I'm talking about, right? They're called annoying habits. We all have these. We all have these. For some of you, it's the way they brush their teeth. For some of you, it is the way they slurp their drink. For some of you, it's them chewing with their mouth open and you seeing all of dinner displayed. For some of you, it's the smacking of their lips that echoes down the hallway. For some of you, it's those toenail clippings they forgot to pick up. For some of you, it's those beard shavings on the sink counter that were not wiped down. For some of you, it's their secret nose picking that they think they're hiding from others. We all have them, right? And early on in the relationship, they're cute and they're funny. And then about 15 minutes into the relationship, they're old, they're annoying, and they drive you crazy. They drive you crazy. And so before we move on and talk about our sermon, can we just all come to an agreement about something? Can we just all agree about something that's really important? And it's this: everybody drives you crazy. Everybody drives you crazy. And you drive everyone else crazy. Now, part of the problem, it's not them. It's me. It's us. While everyone drives you crazy, the truth of the matter is you drive everyone else crazy. Last week, we talked about we talked about how we live in a selfie world. How we live in a selfie world. That today we have a greater sense of connectedness globally because of digital inventions, internet, cell phones. We can connect with people all over the planet. And yet we are experiencing an epidemic growing, an epidemic of loneliness and isolation because we are relationally more disconnected than ever, even though we are more connected than ever. And the alarming wake-up call that we realize is that we are realizing that we are experiencing the eroding away of community from society. That we are experiencing a society without genuine, real, relational, human community and connectedness. And the solution then is not found in a better me. It's not found in an improved me. It's found in a better we. And because we is the fix for me. But if you're like me, you're probably thinking, yeah, that sounds good in theory. That's just not the real world. People drive me crazy. People drive me crazy. It's easy to talk about the importance of being together, the importance of community, but what in the world do you do when you cannot stand being in the same room as somebody else? What do you do when somebody drives you crazy and you just don't want to be around them? Well, before we offer a solution, let's further diagnose some degrees of crazy. And so this is meant to be comic relief, so it's okay to laugh at this, okay? But we got the constant talker. The constant talker. This person doesn't breathe between their words. You wonder if today is the day when they're talking to you that they are going to faint in front of you. They will ask you a question and they will go ahead and answer it without giving you room to answer it. Because they are the constant talker. Then you have the close talker. This person is not aware of personal space. This personal bubbles and distance, they're not really aware of it. And you find yourself, when you're in a conversation with them, backing further and further and further away from them to kind of keep some distance to have a conversation. And if somebody were to film this and then hit fast forward, they would not think that you are in a conversation, but that you are doing a waltz with them. What about the silent starer? They never speak. They just look at you. They just stare at you, and they wait for you to say something. And there's usually no facial expressions, and sometimes you wonder if they're still alive, and you just kind of want to wave your hand in front of their eyes and say, hello, is anybody in there? Anybody home? What about the annoyer? This one takes many forms, and a lot of times this person's unaware that they are the annoyer. It's the excessive questions. It's the odd odor. It's the way they eat. It's the way they clean their teeth in meetings. It is those annoying habits that drive you crazy, that they're unaware they're doing. And then there's the one-upper. This person always one-ups you on every story, on everything you say. And you know what I'm talking about, right? You could have had the worst day of your life, but rest assured theirs was worse. You might have slammed your finger in the door, tripped over your shoelaces, landed on your coffee as you were heading to a job interview, and yet their day was worse. They say, you think that's bad? Last night, a tree fell on my house, killed my dog, and aliens abducted my family. The story, no matter what it is always worse than yours. How about the megaphone mouth? This person doesn't have whisper in their vocabulary. Everything they say is projected 10 times louder than what needs to be said. And when you are at a restaurant or you are at a movie theater, whether you are a Christian or not, you just pray and hope that nobody calls them during that time. And sometimes you feel guilty listening into their conversations, but you just cannot help it because it's like they're speaking into a megaphone. Now, this is just a handful of things that drive people crazy, things that we do that drive people crazy. And the funny thing is, when we went through this list, I bet for most of us, we had names to these. We had names that we go, oh yeah, you're there, you're there. I think I'm there, but I won't admit that. But, you know, we have names to these lists. And the funny thing is, if somebody else has a list and your name's on that list. And so for fun, I would encourage you to write what you do that drives other people crazy. And right or wrong, this is reality, is it not? This is reality. People drive us crazy, and we drive everyone else crazy. So how do we deal with people who drive us crazy? How do we deal with people? When you open up and you read the Gospels, that's the biographies of Jesus, you discover that Jesus had his fair share of crazy people in his life. And it wasn't the people that he occasionally ran into, it was his disciples. His disciples were crazy. And the amazing thing is, Jesus did not just put up with these guys, he chose to invest his life into these guys. And the result was this band of misfits changed the world. And if there's one person on this planet who had every right not to trust people, had every right to look down on people because of their failings, because of their imperfection, it was Jesus. And yet we don't see Jesus do that. Rusty George, pastor in Southern California, he wrote the book Better Together, which the series is based around. He comments about Jesus' temptation. Right? Scripture says that Jesus was tempted in every way as we are, yet he was without sin, that Jesus encountered the things that we encounter, yet he did that perfectly, without caving into sin. And he says this about the temptation of Jesus. He says, I think a big temptation Jesus, faced was to look at all of his disciples and say, you are idiots. Why am I wasting my time with you? And that sounds harsh. That sounds really harsh until you read the Bible. And then you think, yeah, how did he not say that? I mean, some of the things that they did, some of the things that they said, they would have driven you crazy. They would have driven me crazy. And so how did Jesus deal with his crazy disciples? Let's take a look at what Jesus did. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus gets news that his own cousin was murdered. His own cousin, John the Baptist, his head was cut off. And Jesus is heartbroken. He is heartbroken. And so he leaves to find a quiet place to grieve the loss. I mean, do you blame him? Matthew 14:13. When Jesus heard what had happened, that John had been killed, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. And when somebody loses a family member, when somebody loses somebody close to them and they want space to grieve, what is the most obvious thing to do? You give them space, right? And look at the response the crowd has in the next part. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. You would think it's a no-brainer to give Jesus some space, to let him go to that solitary place to grieve. But not the crowd. I mean, they think, oh, hey, he's on the move. Let's hunt him down and see if we can get something from him. And so how does Jesus respond to this crowd? Verse 14. When Jesus landed and he saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. And who in their right mind goes up to somebody who lost a family member and says something like, hey, I'm really sorry about your loss. Can you cover my lunch? Hey, I'm sorry they died. My drink's $1.97. Can you get that? Like, who does that? And in fact, you would expect the opposite. That when somebody dies, it's like, hey, I'll go ahead and take that bill. Yet that's not what the crowd does, but what is Jesus' response? Instead of snapping back, instead of looking down, he has compassion. Jesus is filled with compassion. And look at how his disciples respond in verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." The disciples, mind you, they're not protecting Jesus. They don't do anything to protect his privacy, to protect him having some time to grieve his own cousin's death. And instead of encouraging Jesus, they overload him with problems. They overload him with problems. Strike one for the disciples. And instead of having the decency to figure out how to handle the problems themselves, they go to Jesus and they tell Jesus what he needs to do. Jesus, this is what you do. Strike two. And instead of having compassion on the crowds like Jesus did, their solution is to get them out of their hair. Just to get them out of there. Strike three. So how does Jesus respond? How does Jesus respond? A difficult life situation where his cousin has died. He has a very needy group of people in his life, and he has very demanding friends. How does Jesus respond to that? Verse 16. Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." You give them something to eat. Which is a very interesting response to have. Jesus turns the situation around and he challenges them to figure out how to solve the problem. He says, we're not going to send the crowds away. No, you're going to figure out what to do. You're going to figure out how to feed this crowd. Here Jesus gives compassion. He gives compassion to the crowds, but he gives assignments to the disciples. He gives compassion to the crowds, but assignments to the disciples. And so the disciple, they grab some little kid's lunchbox. And they say, well, here you go, Jesus. Will this do? It's almost kind of this snarky response that they give to Jesus. And so Jesus takes those 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish. He prays, he blesses it, and he gives it back to the disciples to distribute, to feed to the crowd. And the text says 5,000 men, which didn't include women and children. So there's an upwards of 15 to 20,000 people present with Jesus. Just an unbelievable amount of people. And everybody eats. Nobody goes home hungry. And yet when the disciples leave to go collect the leftovers, the scraps of food, they have 12 baskets full of fish and bread to eat. And not long after this miracle, Jesus does the same exact thing for 4,000 men, not including women and children, so 10, 15,000. And the disciples, again, they're stumped. And they don't know what to do. They don't know how to feed this crowd. I mean, it's like they have already forgotten what Jesus did. Look at how the disciples respond. Verse 33. His disciples answered, "Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd?" Ask Jesus? I mean, I know that's the Sunday school answer, but that seems like the right answer here. I mean, how can they be so clueless? How could they be so dull? I mean, I wonder if it was at all tempting, if it all ran across Jesus' mind to begin thinking about recruiting different guys for the job. They're just not getting it. How about this story? The story of Jesus' transfiguration. The disciples had not seen one, but 2 miraculous feedings. They saw Jesus walk across the water, and Peter himself makes that great confession, right? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Peter says, "Upon this I will build my church." And so Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, 3 out of the 12, he takes them up with him on the mountain, Peter, James, and John. And the most stunning thing happens. Moses and Elijah show up. Two of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament. They show up. And Jesus' very appearance changes. It transfigures. Jesus is shining like the sun. And Peter, being the wordsmith that he is, he says this in Matthew 17, verse 4. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And Peter saw Moses, he saw Elijah, and he saw Jesus, and he said, let me build you some houses up here. Let me build you some homes that you guys can live in. And in Mark's account of this, he says Peter didn't even have a clue what he was saying. Mark 9:6. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. He didn't know what he was saying. He didn't know what he was asking. And the funniest thing is, Peter is mumbling through what he's saying. And it's as Peter's mumbling nonsense, God interrupts Peter and just says, Peter, stop talking. Just listen to my son. Just be done. Be done now. 17, verse 5. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Peter, stop talking now. Just listen to Jesus. And Peter struggled to pick up on the most obvious cues. And apparently he just continued to struggle to listen to Jesus. Now, have you ever had a conversation with somebody, and in the middle of your conversation, they bring up something that is completely unrelated to everything you've been talking about? And the whole time you're just scratching your head thinking, where in the world did this come from? And how does this even relate to what we're talking about? Right, that's Peter. That's Peter. And apparently this was an ongoing struggle with Jesus and his disciples. And in fact, when Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they leave the mountain, they almost immediately get in a debate about who the greatest disciple is. Luke 9:46. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. And I can't prove this, but you can just picture how that conversation came about, right? I imagine that it was either Peter, James, or John, likely Peter, who brought it up. Hey, who do you think Jesus' favorite is? They just had this retreat with Jesus. It was a pretty astounding event that happened. So they're all kind of like talking, and well, I was on a boat with you. I think I might be it. I'm not sure. Somebody, I was at work when Jesus called, and I think that was pretty important. I might be it. And then one of the three pipes up and says, well, Jesus took us up on a mountain. We saw the most stunning thing, but he told us we can't tell you. I mean, can't you just picture that? And apparently they still don't get it, because Jesus, he corrects this. He corrects this immediately. And they're still arguing about it. Pretty much all the way up until Jesus' death. The last several hours, they're still debating who Jesus' favorite is. It's just crazy. I mean, here they have heard Jesus teach against things like pride. That what matters is being last, not first. That what is most important is being a servant to all, and they're stuck on who is the greatest. The disciples are crazy. The disciples are crazy. So what can we learn about the disciples? What can we learn about dealing with the crazy disciples from Jesus? Well, if we go back to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 men, we have a very powerful principle to live by. A very powerful principle that we can apply to all of our lives. When the disciples came to him and they told Jesus, Jesus, you send the crowd away. Jesus had compassion on the crowds, and he said, I'm not going to send them away. You feed them. And we see that Jesus gave compassion to the crowds, but he gave responsibilities to the disciples. which is really profound given the disciples' track record, right? Jesus showed remarkable trust for his disciples, despite how much they let him down. Despite how much they must have frustrated Jesus. Despite the fact that they betrayed Jesus. Jesus accepted his disciples as they were, not as they should have been. Jesus accepted his disciples as they were, not as they should have been. And likewise, we should accept people for who they are, not as they should be or not as we want them to be. Having a toddler, I am reminded of this on a daily basis. There are times where my daughter does things that just seem so grown up. And it's amazing to watch that. And then there are other times when my daughter does things that are fitting for a toddler to do. And I find myself getting frustrated, becoming short and sharp when she does not act more grown up than what she is. I find myself getting frustrated because I expected her to live and to act not as a toddler, but as a grown-up. And so often we do this with people. We tend to accept them until we get to know them. And when they don't measure up, we move on or reject them. But notice what Jesus did with the feeding of the 5,000. He showed compassion to those who were far from him, but he gave responsibility to those who were close to him. And likewise, we should show compassion to those who are far from us, those who are far from God, but give responsibility to those who are close to you, those who are close in their relationship with God. He cared for the crowd of needy people, and he empowered the disciples with responsibility to feed the crowd. And so often that gets flipped around. We tend to give responsibility to complete strangers, assignments to complete strangers, and then we get disappointed when they don't do things how we wanted them to be done. And we tend to overlook problem areas and those who are closest to us for fear that we might offend them, and then we get disappointed when we don't see any change take place in their life. But when you give responsibility to somebody, it builds incredible trust. It restores trust in a relationship. And it calls them to a higher standard of life, to a higher standard of living. For example, here is how we get our daughter to do things that we want done in the house. And I am not perfect at this. And in fact, I flunked out on this last night when I was trying to do this. But when I want to get my daughter to do something, I used to say, and I did this last night, and it flopped on me. I'll say, honey, go pick up your toys. Can you go throw this away? Normally, sometimes she ignores me. Other times, she just tells me no. And so I realized it's not really effective. And so instead, what actually works almost all the time, not all the time, but almost all the time, I say, hey, Augustine, can you help Daddy out with something? Can you help me out? And her face lights up. She gets excited, and she's not just willing to do it, she's excited to do it for Mom or for Dad because we are trusting her with something. She feels valued with the responsibility that we have given to her. And afterwards, she walks away with her chin held high, more willing to do the next thing because we have made her feel like she's a big girl. And when we can give responsibility to those who are closest to us, it communicates to them not just that we trust them, but that we believe in them. And that is incredibly empowering to somebody. It's incredibly empowering when somebody does that for you. When somebody looks at you and they are clearly can do it themselves. and they want you to do it. They want to invest in you, and they want to see you succeed. There is nothing more energizing and hopeful than that. And for some of us in here, we have forgotten to trust people. We have forgotten to trust people. At some point along the journey of life, somebody has disappointed you. Somebody has failed you. Somebody has betrayed you, and you just think, what's the point? What's the point of trusting them? They're just going to let me down. They're just going to fail me. They're just going to disappoint me. What's the point of going through all of that again? And at some point along the journey, we have forgotten to trust people. Yet Jesus' disciples, they disappointed him. They denied him. And one of them even betrayed Jesus. And yet Jesus still chose to invest his life into them. And he still chose to give them responsibility despite how imperfect they were. In fact, everything the disciples did, Jesus could have done like 1,000,000 times better. And yet he still chose them to do it. And that changed the world. And maybe the reason you came here this morning is because you have forgotten to trust and you need to give somebody a second chance. This week, instead of doing everything yourself, bring somebody else along with you. Share the responsibility, share the load. Don't carry it all yourself. And when somebody else does something, instead of getting frustrated because they didn't do things the way that you would have done it or the way that you wanted them to do it, encourage them with what was done. Encourage them with the heart to participate, the heart to help. Now, Jesus also showed compassion to those who were far from him. So this week, when you run into somebody who drives you nuts, who drives you crazy, who when you see them, you just kind of turn the other way and you walk because you just don't want to face them. Instead of getting angry, instead of getting annoyed, show compassion. Especially toward those who are far from God, those who don't have a relationship with God. And instead of getting frustrated or angry with their choice of life and how they are choosing to live and treat people, instead of getting frustrated, instead of getting annoyed, show compassion to those who are far from you and far from God. One of the things that's helpful for me when I find myself having a tendency to get annoyed at people, I pray and I say, God, show me your heart for these people. Help me see them the way that you see them, not the way that I see them. The bottom line for each and every one of us in here is that no one in here deserved God's grace. None of us deserve God's love. Yet God still chose to give it to us. There's nothing we can do to earn our salvation. There's nothing we can do to earn God's love, to earn God's grace, because we have already messed that up in a way that is irreversible. That on our own, there is absolutely no hope. And that's exactly why Jesus came. That's exactly why Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and that's exactly why Jesus rose from the dead, because he came to reverse something that could not be changed. He came to fix something that was eternally broken. He came to redeem something that was unredeemable. Because he is a compassionate God who not only enjoys, who not only loves to save, but he loves to empower his kids for work. And so, when we show compassion, when we give responsibility, we witness something that's miraculous. We experience somebody else transforming. We see somebody else changing. And the amazing thing is, they're not the only ones who change in the process. We change too. And we discover that even with imperfect people, even with people in our lives who drive us crazy, even when people do things differently than us, when people are imperfect, we discover why we are still better when we are together. Even with imperfect, broken people, we are still better. Let me close with a quote from one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. And he writes about the danger of not loving, the danger of not opening our lives up to community, the danger of withholding ourselves, of being alone, of being isolated, the danger of not expressing love. He says this: to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, and irredeemable. And it's a sobering reminder, I think, that C.S. Lewis penned, that so often when we look at somebody else, we think, they're going to hurt me. I don't know if I can trust them. And the human tendency is to pull back, is to isolate, is to be alone. And when that happens, we find our heart begins to callous and become harder and harder. And the things that we struggle with, they just seem to grow to an intensity that we never experienced or expected. And the solution is community. The solution is we. Even when people drive us crazy, we are still better with imperfect people in our lives than we are when we are by ourselves. And so I just want to leave on that note and open it up to some reflection of where you're at. Have you isolated yourself? Have you pushed other people away? Maybe because of pain, maybe because of hurt, maybe because of insecurities, maybe because of something that is going on in your life and you just don't want people to know about. My challenge for you is not to pull back or to push back, but to let God change your life through people being involved in your life.